The courtroom was already full when the old woman walked in. The sound of quiet chatter echoed off the wooden walls, and the smell of coffee from the hallway still lingered in the air. People turned their heads when they saw her, an elderly lady walking slowly with a small handbag pressed close to her chest. Her steps were careful, her shoes a little worn, and her thin gray hair peeked from under a small hat. She looked fragile, like someone's grandmother who had lost her way into the wrong place. The guard at the door gave her a polite nod, holding the door open just a little longer than usual. She smiled faintly and whispered a "thank you" before making her way toward the front of the courtroom. It was a small case, a simple parking violation. Nothing serious. Most people would have just paid the fine and gone on with their day. But this woman, whose name on the case file read Margaret Whitmore, had chosen to contest it. And that decision alone had caught the attention of the young judge sitting behind the bench. Judge Coleman was known for his impatience. He was in his mid-30s, full of ambition, and proud of how quickly he could clear a courtroom. He believed time was precious and didn't like people who wasted it, especially over things like parking tickets. When he saw Margaret walking slowly to the front, he sighed quietly and glanced at the clock. "Let's make this quick," he muttered under his breath before saying out loud, "Case number 247, the city versus Mrs. Whitmore." Margaret nodded politely and took her place near the microphone. Her voice was soft but clear. "Good morning, Your Honor." The judge didn't bother returning the greeting. "Mrs. Whitmore, it says here that you parked in a no parking zone in front of City Hall last month. The fine is $75. Why are we here today?" The woman adjusted her glasses and smiled gently. "Your Honor, I didn't park there knowingly. I had stopped for only a few minutes because—" The judge interrupted, waving his hand. "Because? Everyone has a reason, ma'am. But rules are rules. The sign is very clear." Margaret hesitated. "Yes, but the sign was partly covered by construction tape. I thought—" Again he cut her off. "You thought wrong, Mrs. Whitmore. If everyone decided which rules they liked or didn't like, we'd have chaos." A few people in the courtroom chuckled quietly. The judge leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the sound of his own authority. Margaret's face didn't change. She stood there calmly, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "I understand, Your Honor," she said softly. "But I'd just like to explain—" "Explain what?" The judge said, his tone sharp now. "That the sign was invisible? That the city is unfair? Come on, Mrs. Whitmore, this is a $75 ticket. You're wasting everyone's time." Someone in the back row whispered, "Poor lady." And another person snickered. Margaret took a deep breath. "I'm not here to waste anyone's time, Your Honor. I believe there's more to justice than fines and forms. Sometimes fairness means listening." The judge rolled his eyes. "Listening? Mrs. Whitmore, I've been listening all morning, and if I listened to every excuse people gave me, we'd be here till midnight. You broke a parking rule, simple as that. Pay the fine and we can all move on." She looked at him quietly for a long moment. Then she said in a steady voice, "I've spent most of my life listening to people, Your Honor. You'd be surprised how much you learn when you do." The judge didn't know how to respond to that. He frowned slightly, tapping his pen against the desk. "Are you trying to lecture me, ma'am?" "No," she said gently. "I'm simply speaking from experience." There was something in the way she said it, calm, respectful but with quiet strength, that made the room fall silent for a second. Judge Coleman cleared his throat. "Well, Mrs. Whitmore, experience or not, you broke the law. You're lucky it's only a small fine. Some people don't get second chances." Margaret smiled faintly. "I understand that too well, Your Honor." Her tone wasn't defensive or angry. It was the kind of tone that made you feel like she knew something you didn't, something deep and important. Still, the judge wasn't having it. He leaned forward. "Look, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not here to argue. I'm here to keep order. If you want to fight this ticket, you'll need evidence. Do you have any?" She reached into her handbag and carefully pulled out a small envelope. Inside were 2 photographs printed on paper. She handed them to the court officer, who passed them up to the bench. The judge looked at the photos and frowned. One showed a street corner with construction cones and caution tape flapping in the wind. The other showed the no parking sign, half covered by a large piece of yellow tape. He sighed. "All right, I see your point. But this could have been avoided if you'd parked somewhere else. You still stopped in a restricted zone." "I did," she admitted. but only because I was helping someone who had fallen on the sidewalk. It was an elderly man who tripped on a broken curb. I couldn't just leave him there. A murmur ran through the room. Even the judge paused for a moment. "You expect me to believe that?" he asked finally. She nodded. "You don't have to believe it, Your Honor. You can check with the city's street cameras. It happened right in front of City Hall." He stared at her. "You're saying you stopped illegally to help someone?" "Yes," she said. "Because that's what I was taught the law should protect. People doing the right thing, not just following the rule book." There was something about the way she said that sentence that hit the room differently. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but it carried weight. The judge leaned back again, visibly uncomfortable. "Well, even good intentions don't erase the law, Mrs. Whitmore." She nodded. "I know. But sometimes the law is about understanding why people do what they do, not just punishing them for it." For a long second, he didn't say anything. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him. People weren't laughing anymore. Trying to regain control, he smiled stiffly. "You seem to have strong opinions for someone who's just here about a parking ticket." Margaret smiled back, a small, knowing smile. "Let's just say I've spent enough years around courtrooms to know how they work." The judge gave a half laugh. "Oh, really? You've been here before?" "A few times," she said. "Though not on this side of the bench." He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" She looked at him with calm eyes. "I mean that I used to stand where you are, Your Honor." The words hung in the air. For a second, no one moved. The court clerk looked up from her paperwork and the murmurs started again. But the judge didn't understand yet. He assumed she was joking. "You used to be a judge?" he asked, smiling as if she'd told a funny story. She shook her head gently. "No, I was an attorney. For nearly 40 years," the judge blinked. "An attorney?" "Yes," she said. "I practiced in this very courthouse long before you ever sat in that chair." He frowned slightly, unsure whether to believe her. She certainly didn't look like an attorney. Her clothes were simple, her hands slightly shaky, her voice calm and grandmotherly. "Is that so?" he asked finally, half skeptical. She nodded. "That's so." The courtroom went quiet again. The judge tried to laugh it off, but something in her eyes told him she wasn't lying. There was a confidence there, quiet but firm. The kind of confidence that only comes from years of experience, from standing in front of people who doubted you and proving them wrong. Still, he tried to stay in control of the situation. "Well, Mrs. Whitmore, whether or not you used to be an attorney, today you're here as a defendant. And the law applies to everyone equally." She smiled again. "I agree with that completely, Your Honor." He nodded, satisfied, but deep down something about her words stuck with him. He didn't know it yet, but the woman standing before him was far more than she appeared to be. And as the day went on, everyone in that courtroom would soon find out exactly who Margaret Whitmore really was. Because sometimes, the people we underestimate the most are the ones who teach us the biggest lessons. As the courtroom fell into an uncomfortable silence, the judge leaned back in his chair, still processing what Margaret had just revealed. He stared at her for a long moment, not quite believing it, but not willing to show any sign of uncertainty. His face, which had been sharp with sarcasm only moments before, now wore an expression that was harder to read. The shift in his attitude was subtle but noticeable. Margaret stood there, calm as ever, waiting for the judge to respond. She wasn't in a hurry. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But the people in the room could sense that something had shifted, something deeper than just the simple parking ticket she had come to contest. Judge Coleman cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. He flipped through the papers on his desk as if looking for something to anchor himself back to the case. "All right, Mrs. Whitmore," he began, his voice colder now. "It seems you have quite a history, but that doesn't change the fact that you parked illegally, and frankly, it doesn't change the law." Margaret nodded, still holding the same quiet dignity. "I understand, Your Honor, but I also believe the law should serve people, not just punish them." A soft chuckle came from the back of the courtroom. One of the younger lawyers, maybe one of the interns, obviously trying to hold back a laugh. The judge glanced in their direction and raised an eyebrow, as if to remind everyone who was in charge. He wasn't going to let himself be distracted. Not by some kind old woman who thought she could lecture him. "Mrs. Whitmore," Judge Coleman continued, his voice dripping with impatience, "if you think that your years of experience make you exempt from the rules, you are sorely mistaken. Everyone has to follow the same laws. That's what keeps order. Margaret remained unfazed. That's true, Your Honor. But sometimes the law isn't enough to see the whole picture. It's not just about following rules, it's about understanding why they exist and who they affect. The judge glanced at the crowd, his eyes narrowing, and for a moment it seemed like he was trying to decide how much he should let this woman get away with. He had heard similar arguments before, but coming from an elderly woman who seemed so unassuming, it felt different. But Judge Coleman wasn't one to back down easily. He straightened his posture, making sure everyone knew who was in charge here. Are you saying, Mrs. Whitmore, that your actions were somehow more important than the law itself? Because that's what it sounds like you're implying. That somehow your experience, your age, or whatever else you think gives you special treatment should make you exempt from the rules that the rest of us have to follow. Margaret's response was slow, deliberate. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She just seemed to be waiting for him to understand. No, Your Honor, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that the law should be fair to all people, no matter who they are. And sometimes we need to take into account the intent behind an action, not just the action itself. There was a pause. The courtroom was silent except for the occasional shuffle of paper or someone clearing their throat. But the judge was having none of it. He had his own vision of justice, and he wasn't going to let an old woman stand there and tell him otherwise. His voice was sharp as he continued. I don't think you understand, Mrs. Whitmore. Rules are rules no matter the reason. Your intentions don't matter. It's not my job to question why someone breaks the law, it's my job to enforce it. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. You owe $75 for this ticket. Margaret took a step forward, her eyes never leaving his. And I respect your job, Your Honor, but sometimes the law needs to show mercy, not just punishment, just as you might show mercy to someone in your own family, someone who made a mistake. The words were quiet, but they hit hard. For a moment, the judge's confident, almost cocky demeanor faltered. He didn't expect that. No one had ever questioned his interpretation of justice so calmly, so directly. Well, I'm not here to show mercy, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm here to make sure people follow the law, he said, his voice becoming more defensive. He was trying to cover up his uncertainty. Margaret nodded, a slight smile tugging at her lips. I understand. But what happens when the law itself is wrong, Your Honor? Do we just follow it blindly? Or do we question it to make sure it serves everyone equally? For a brief second, the judge looked at her as if he didn't know how to respond. The room seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for some kind of dramatic conclusion to what had just become a battle of wills. The judge let out a frustrated sigh and ran his hand through his hair. You're making this harder than it has to be, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm not going to sit here and debate philosophical theories with you. This is a simple case. You broke the rules. You pay the fine. End of story. But there was a shift in the room now. The audience had stopped whispering. People were looking at Margaret with a different kind of respect. The judge hadn't expected that either. He had assumed that his authority would go unchallenged, especially not by an old woman who looked as if she were from another time. Someone in the back row muttered, She's right, though. It's not always about the rules. It's about what's right. The judge shot a sharp look in their direction, but the words had already been heard. People were starting to take sides, whether the judge wanted them to or not. He could feel the shift, the energy in the room changing. Margaret was no longer just the defendant in this case. She had become something more. Judge Coleman felt the pressure now, like the weight of everyone's eyes was on him. He had always prided himself on being a no-nonsense kind of judge. He didn't care about the stories behind the cases or the people who came before him. He just wanted to get through his day as quickly as possible. But something about this woman had rattled him. He could see it in the way the people in the courtroom were looking at him, waiting to see how he would respond. They were starting to wonder if he would truly be fair, or if he was simply a man who liked to throw his weight around. Margaret wasn't trying to argue. She wasn't trying to get him to change his mind. She wasn't even raising her voice. But somehow she was getting through to him in ways that no one else ever had. Your Honor, she said quietly. I'm not here to make excuses or tell you how to do your job. I'm just here to ask you to look at this situation with a little more understanding. Sometimes it's not about what's in the rulebook, it's about what's in our hearts. There was a long pause. Finally, the judge spoke again, but his voice wasn't as certain. I don't know what you expect from me, Mrs. Whitmore. Margaret smiled, almost as if she were seeing something in him that he didn't even see in himself. I expect nothing, Your Honor, but I hope that before you make a decision, you remember that the law is meant to protect people, not just punish them. For a brief moment, the judge looked at her as if he were about to respond, but something in her eyes made him stop. He looked away, his expression unreadable, and turned to the papers on his desk, his hands shaking slightly. The room was quiet again. But this time it wasn't because of mockery. It was because everyone knew that something important had just happened. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, thick and heavy. Judge Coleman, still sitting behind the bench, had his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him, but his mind wasn't really on the case anymore. His thoughts were tangled, almost as if something in the air had shifted and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He was a man who prided himself on knowing exactly how to handle every situation, but this wasn't a case he could handle so easily. The moments ticked by and the people in the room sat in stillness, waiting to see what would happen next. It felt as though everyone had forgotten they were here for a simple parking violation. Now, it seemed like the courtroom had become a place for something far more important, something deeper. Margaret didn't rush him. She stood there, quiet and composed, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes never leaving the judge. She wasn't worried. She wasn't angry. If anything, she was calm in a way that made her seem far more powerful than she appeared at first glance. There was a certain peace about her, something that came with age, with experience, with years of seeing life from every angle. After a long pause, Judge Coleman finally looked up. He had a lot of thoughts running through his head, but none of them seemed to settle long enough for him to make a decision. Instead, he just stared at her for a moment longer, almost as if he were waiting for her to say something else, something that might give him the clarity he needed to wrap this up. But she just stood there, still as a statue, waiting for him to speak. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his voice softer now, though still carrying the weight of his position. You mentioned something earlier about your past, your experience. I've been thinking about it. And if what you said is true, then I need to ask you a question. Margaret raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. The judge cleared his throat. You said you used to be an attorney. You've practiced law here in this courthouse, right? He paused, watching her carefully. But you never told me what kind of lawyer you were. What kind of work did you do? Margaret's eyes softened. She had been expecting this question, and for a moment she hesitated. She wasn't sure why it mattered to him now. But perhaps he needed to hear it, to understand why she had stood there in front of him, unshaken, why she was so calm in the face of his earlier mockery. I was a civil rights attorney, she said quietly, her voice just above a whisper. I fought for the rights of those who didn't have a voice, for the ones who were forgotten by the system. A murmur passed through the courtroom. Judge Coleman didn't speak right away. Instead, he glanced down at his notes as though trying to connect the dots. There was something about her words, about the quiet power in her voice that made him pause. He didn't know why, but suddenly everything felt different. He wasn't sure if it was because of the respect in the room or the weight of her past that seemed to have filled the space between them. Whatever it was, he realized that he had been wrong about her. Not just in the way he had judged her based on her appearance, but in how he had underestimated her strength. Civil rights, he repeated, his voice still quiet but with a hint of disbelief. So you were one of the ones who helped change things? One of the ones who fought in the courtrooms for equality? Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor. I was part of the movement that pushed for justice when the laws were stacked against people who didn't have the privilege to fight back. She paused, as if she were reflecting on a time long past. I fought in a time when it wasn't popular to stand up for what was right, when every case was a battle, not just in court but in the hearts of the people we were trying to help. Judge Coleman was quiet for a moment. He looked down at the table in front of him, turning the thought over in his mind. He was processing everything. Her words, the calm authority in her voice, the way she had carried herself through the entire case. But what surprised him most was how it made him feel. It was almost like he had been in a different world just a moment ago, where everything was black and white. And now suddenly everything seemed a little more gray, a little less certain. The courtroom was still. All eyes were on Margaret, and it felt like everyone had collectively held their breath, waiting for the next part of the story. There were no more chuckles, no more mocking whispers, just the quiet hum of curiosity. "I'm sorry," Judge Coleman finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea. I didn't know who you were." He paused and looked at her, the weight of his words sinking in. "I didn't realize that you've done more for justice than most people in this room will ever know." Margaret smiled gently, but it wasn't a smile of pride. It was a smile that spoke of years of hard work, of battles fought not for recognition but for the greater good. It was the kind of smile that came from someone who had seen the struggle and kept moving forward, even when the odds were stacked against them. "I didn't do it for recognition, Your Honor," she said softly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. And sometimes when you know something is right, you just keep pushing no matter what." There was another long pause in the room, and Judge Coleman, for the first time that day, looked genuinely humbled. He had expected this to be just another case, another violation to clear off his docket, but now it felt like he had stumbled upon something much more profound, something he had never really thought about before. "Thank you for sharing that with me," the judge said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't expect this, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm sorry for my earlier behavior. I didn't give you the respect you deserved." Margaret simply nodded. "There's no need to apologize, Your Honor. I'm not here to make you feel guilty. I'm here because I believe in fairness and I believe in second chances. We all make mistakes," she paused. "Even judges." The judge swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling in. He wasn't used to being on the receiving end of humility, especially not from someone who seemed so quiet and unassuming. And yet here he was, being taught a lesson he hadn't expected. For a moment he looked around the courtroom. The people who had been laughing earlier now sat in silence. They too were realizing the gravity of the situation. They saw it now, not just as a simple ticket or case, but as a chance to learn something about themselves. About fairness. About what it truly meant to serve justice. Judge Coleman slowly nodded, taking a deep breath. He looked at Margaret, who still stood calmly before him, her hands folded neatly in front of her. He could see it now. She wasn't just an old woman with a simple parking ticket. She was a person who had lived a life of purpose, a life where her actions had made a real difference. "I think I understand now," he said quietly. "You're right, Mrs. Whitmore. The law isn't always about black and white. Sometimes it's about understanding the full picture, the heart of the matter." Margaret gave him a small, kind smile. "Exactly, Your Honor. The law can be a tool for good, but it's only effective if we use it with compassion." There was another long pause. The judge stood up and walked to the bench, a feeling of respect settling over him in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I'm dismissing the ticket. I believe you've made your case, and I think it's only right that we move forward with understanding." He looked at her with a new sense of admiration. "You've earned that respect today." And with that, the courtroom, which had been so full of tension just moments before, seemed to exhale. The audience seemed relieved, almost as though they too had been on this journey with Margaret. Margaret smiled not out of triumph, but because she knew that sometimes the smallest moments could carry the greatest lessons. And today, she had taught not only the judge but everyone in that room that justice was more than just a set of rules. It was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. The judge's words hung in the air for a moment, leaving the courtroom in an almost surreal silence. People didn't know what to say. The whole atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't just the case that had changed, it was something deeper, something that went beyond a parking ticket, beyond rules and procedures. For a moment, it seemed like the court itself had been transformed into a place where real human connection, respect, and understanding took precedence over the letter of the law. Margaret had done what seemed impossible. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't argued or fought with the judge. She hadn't even gotten angry when he mocked her. Instead, she had used something far more powerful, her wisdom, her experience, and a quiet, unwavering belief in what was right. She had changed the course of the day with nothing more than a simple, calm conversation. And in that moment, she had earned the respect of everyone in the room, even the judge. As the judge dismissed the case and allowed the ticket to be voided, the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. People who had previously watched the exchange with mild curiosity were now buzzing with new questions. Who was this woman? How had she managed to turn the tables like this? Margaret made her way back to her seat, her footsteps slow but deliberate. She could feel the eyes on her, the weight of the room's gaze, but she wasn't fazed. She had been in far more difficult situations than this one. She had faced real danger in the courtroom, had stood up to powerful men and women who had tried to use their influence to shut her down. This was nothing compared to those battles. But still, there was something about this moment that felt different. It wasn't just about the parking ticket or even the judge's decision. It was about something bigger, a reminder that change could come in the most unexpected of places. Even in a small everyday courtroom like this one, the people in the room began to slowly gather their things, whispering among themselves as they prepared to leave. The tension that had once filled the room was now gone, replaced by a quiet sense of reflection. It was clear that many of them had been touched by what had just unfolded. Margaret didn't rush. She knew that people would want to speak to her, to thank her, or to ask her questions. She was used to that. But she didn't need the praise. She didn't need the attention. All she wanted was to leave the courthouse, go back to her quiet life, and maybe reflect on how things had changed in ways she couldn't even have imagined when she first walked in. As she gathered her things, a young woman from the back of the room came up to her. She was a lawyer, one of the newer faces in the courtroom, probably an intern or someone still in the early stages of their career. The woman hesitated for a moment, looking at Margaret with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you for what you did in there. You showed us all something we need to remember. I've only been practicing for a short time, but I've already seen how easy it is to get caught up in the rules and forget about the people we're serving. You reminded me of why I wanted to become a lawyer in the first place." Margaret smiled at her, her eyes kind. "You'll learn, dear. It's not always easy, but if you remember that law is about people, not just procedures, then you'll be on the right path." The young woman nodded, clearly moved. "I'll try to remember that," she said before walking back to join the others. Margaret stood there for a moment watching the young lawyer leave. She wasn't sure why, but it made her feel a sense of warmth. A reminder that even small acts could leave a ripple that spread out into the world, touching others in ways that weren't always visible at first. She turned to leave the courtroom, but before she could step out, she heard a voice from behind her. It was the judge again. "Mrs. Whitmore, if I could have a word with you," he called. Margaret turned around, her expression soft but neutral. She wasn't sure what more there was to say, but she wasn't about to dismiss him. The last few minutes had been a whirlwind, and now it seemed like he wanted to make things right, to truly understand what had just happened. "Of course, Your Honor," she said, walking back toward the judge's bench. He stood up slowly, his hands clasped in front of him. His earlier sharpness had faded, replaced by something quieter, something more human. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "I want to apologize again," he said, his voice sincere but still holding the weight of authority, "not just for the ticket, not just for how I treated you in the beginning, but for how I've treated so many others before. I've been so focused on the law and following the rules to the letter that I've forgotten the most important part. Why the law exists in the first place. It's not to punish people, it's to protect them." Margaret watched him closely, sensing the depth of his words. He wasn't just apologizing for his behavior in the courtroom. He was reflecting on something deeper. It was clear that the exchange had affected him in a way that wasn't just about this case. It was about his role as a judge, his responsibilities, and how he carried himself in the courtroom. He had been forced to confront the fact that the law wasn't just a set of rules to be followed blindly. It was something that needed to be applied with compassion, with understanding, and with a recognition of the humanity of the people involved. "I didn't see it before," he continued, looking at her with a kind of quiet respect. "But you opened my eyes today. You reminded me that there's more to justice than just enforcing the law. There's a bigger picture." Margaret nodded. "I'm glad to hear you say that, Your Honor. But remember, sometimes it's not about seeing everything all at once. It's about making the right choice when the time comes. Small steps can make a big difference. The judge seemed to consider her words carefully, letting them sink in. He didn't respond right away, but there was a look of deep thought on his face, as if the weight of everything that had happened was finally catching up to him. "I'll try to do better," he said, his voice quieter now. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore, for reminding me of that." She smiled, a gentle, understanding smile. "It's never too late to change, Your Honor. We're all just learning as we go." With that, Margaret turned and walked out of the courtroom, the doors closing softly behind her. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had done what she came to do. Outside the courthouse, the sun had started to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over everything. It was the kind of evening that made everything feel peaceful, as if the world itself was taking a deep breath and settling into a moment of calm. Margaret made her way down the steps, her steps steady and sure. She wasn't rushing anywhere. She didn't have to. She had earned this moment of peace. As she walked down the street, she thought about the day, about the judge, and about the people in that courtroom who had witnessed what had just unfolded. She had been just one person, but sometimes one person could make a difference, even in a world that seemed full of rules and systems that didn't always work in favor of the people they were meant to protect. In the end, she knew that the true victory wasn't in winning the case. It was in reminding the people around her, especially the judge, that the law, no matter how strict, had to have a heart. And she had managed to reach that heart today just by being herself. The world might be full of rules, but it was also full of people. And sometimes people needed to be seen, they needed to be understood, and they needed to know that there was always room for kindness, even in the most unexpected places. Margaret didn't need any applause. She didn't need any fanfare. She had done what she came to do, remind everyone that justice was more than just a set of rules. It was a promise to protect, to care, and to always stand up for what was right. The evening air had a coolness to it as Margaret stepped out of the courthouse, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a relief. The stress of the day seemed to evaporate as she walked away, her pace steady but unhurried. She didn't look back at the courthouse. She didn't need to. The moment had passed, and it had passed in a way that felt right. There was nothing left to prove. She had done what she came for, and now it was time to let the world move on. As she walked down the steps of the courthouse and onto the street, her mind drifted to her past, the cases she had fought, the battles she had won, but more than that, the ones she had lost. There had been plenty of those too. There were always victories and there were always setbacks, but each step had shaped her, taught her something new. The years hadn't been easy, but they had given her perspective. And in this moment she knew that this quiet, seemingly simple encounter was part of that long journey. She could still hear the echoes of the conversation in the courtroom. Judge Coleman's apology, the young lawyer's words. It was a reminder that change, even small change, mattered. Even the smallest moments could leave ripples, and those ripples could turn into waves. Maybe today would be a tiny ripple in the bigger story of justice, but Margaret knew those ripples were important. As she walked along the street, the hum of city life surrounded her. The bustle of people going about their day, the distant sound of traffic, the clattering of footsteps, everything seemed so normal, so ordinary. Yet to her it felt like a world she had seen 100 times before, but never quite the same. The world outside the courthouse might be moving in its usual rhythm, but she felt like something had shifted. A small change, a shift in the air, in the heart of the judge, in the people who had witnessed what happened. She hoped that what they saw today would stay with them for a while. Back at the courthouse, Judge Coleman sat at his desk, still turning over the events of the day in his mind. He had dismissed the ticket, yes, but what had truly changed wasn't just the outcome of that case. It was the way he had seen the world that had shifted. Margaret had stood there in front of him, calm and composed, not demanding anything from him, but simply making him realize something about the law that he had been missing. For years, Judge Coleman had seen the courtroom as a place where rules and laws were followed without question. He had believed that the law was above all else, that it was the judge's job to make sure it was enforced no matter the circumstances. But today, Margaret had reminded him that the law wasn't some abstract idea to be followed blindly. It was about people, real people, the ones who sat in the courtroom, the ones who faced the consequences of decisions made by judges like him. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples, trying to process the emotions he had felt that afternoon. His pride had gotten in the way before. His need to appear authoritative had clouded his judgment. But Margaret's quiet strength had broken through that. He realized now that a judge wasn't just a figurehead who made rulings. A judge had to see the humanity in every case. They had to recognize that everyone who stood before them, whether they were guilty or innocent, was more than just the sum of their mistakes. They were people with lives, histories, and stories that were worth understanding. Judge Coleman let out a long sigh. He knew this was a turning point for him. He wasn't going to be the same after today. His approach to the law would be different. He wasn't sure how that would change things in the courtroom, but he knew it would. He didn't just want to be someone who applied the law. He wanted to be someone who applied it with fairness, with compassion, and with the understanding that the law was meant to serve, not just to punish. As the day wore on, Margaret continued her walk through the city. She didn't need to rush home. She wasn't running from anything or to anything. She had no expectations for what the day would bring, but she couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction, like she had set something in motion, a quiet change. She passed a park, the trees beginning to turn with the fall colors, and she paused for a moment to breathe in the crisp air. There was something peaceful about it, something comforting. The world wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But moments like these reminded her that small steps toward goodness mattered. The small acts of kindness, the quiet moments of reflection, they all counted. In her line of work, she had seen enough pain, enough injustice to know that the world could often seem like a cold place. But it wasn't all dark. There was light in places that people didn't often notice. Small pockets of kindness, moments of understanding, where people came together to make things right. As she stood there, a young man approached her. He looked familiar, but she couldn't place him at first. He stopped in front of her, hesitating for a second, then spoke with a smile. "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't know if you remember me, but I saw you in court today," he said, his voice respectful. "I was the one who was called to testify, the one who was here for the traffic ticket case." Margaret smiled gently, nodding as she remembered the young man. "Yes, I remember you. You were a witness in the case, correct?" "That's right," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I just wanted to thank you. The way you spoke to the judge. The way you stood your ground. It made me realize something. I've been so focused on doing everything by the book, following the rules, but I've forgotten what really matters. You reminded me that it's not just about following rules. It's about doing what's right. It's about seeing people for who they are, not just what they've done." Margaret's smile widened slightly. "That's exactly it," she said quietly. "The law is important, but it's the heart of it, the people that make it meaningful." The young man nodded, clearly moved by her words. "I've always wanted to become a lawyer, but after seeing what happened today, I think I want to be the kind of lawyer who cares about people, not just cases. I want to fight for what's right." Margaret's heart warmed at his words. "That's the spirit you need. Remember, it's not always about the big cases or the wins. Sometimes it's the small moments, the ones where you truly see someone and understand their story, that matter the most." As the young man walked away, Margaret continued on her way, feeling a sense of peace that she hadn't realized she was missing. It wasn't about recognition or praise. It wasn't about having the last word. It was about knowing that in some small way she had made a difference. When she got home later that evening, she sat down in her favorite chair by the window, watching the world outside. The streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the sidewalk. The world kept moving, but Margaret knew that today, in this small corner of the world, something had changed. She didn't know if the judge would change his ways permanently. She didn't know if the young man would become the kind of lawyer he dreamed of, but she knew that for now they had been reminded.